we're trying to comprehend our small space within it, and there's something that can be very welcoming towards religion in that sense. Here we also have Stephen Hawking, who passed away a couple of years ago, but he too, an immense theoretical physicist who talked about, not necessarily to the extent that Carl Sagan did, about how science could be a source of spirituality, but that science need not go against religion, right? So he says here, what I have done is to show that it is possible for the way the universe began to be determined by the laws of science, right? And this is, of course, as being opposed to earlier scientific endeavors, which included various gaps in their understanding, of which we often would call it the God of the gaps, right? So in early science, when there was an element of the universe or our understanding of certain laws of nature where we couldn't find an empirical explanation yet, the idea is that that is where God would typically be inserted. And so what Stephen Hawking is saying is that we've just gotten to a point in our scientific understanding where we don't need to appeal to God anymore. But that doesn't mean that God doesn't exist, right? So evidence for one thing, in this case, is not going to be evidence against in the case of God. So he says, in that case, it would not be necessary to appeal to God to decide how the universe began, but this doesn't prove that there is no God, only that God is not necessary, again, for this explanation. All right, so some other terms that are going to be helpful for our understanding in philosophy of religion is the difference between philosophy of religion and theology. So these are two different areas of study, but they're often confused because they tend to answer the same types of questions. So the difference between them are their respective starting points. So both theologians and philosophers of religion will again talk about whether or not God exists, what that God is like, how we can understand that to impact our understanding of the world, perhaps in the nature of evil, what this means for us personally as for whether or not we have a soul, whether or not there's an afterlife, right, and so on and so forth. So even though they're both answering these same questions, a theologian will not count as a philosopher in the sense that they are already starting by presuming a certain religion, and thus its doctrines or beliefs are true, right? So a theologian would answer, right, the question of whether or not God exists by already presuming a certain religion is true, right? So if we're dealing with a Buddhist theologian, right, from the earlier traditions, which were atheistic, right, that theologian would not count as a philosopher because they already presume that no God exists, as opposed to perhaps a Christian or Muslim theologian, right, who would start from the presumption that not only does a God exist, but one God exists, and they already have a pretty good sense of what that God is like from their sacred religious texts. So, how is philosophy of religion different? In philosophy, we are not allowed to take anything for granted, right? So we cannot start off by just assuming some set of beliefs or doctrines are true. So if you are a Christian theologian, for example, who wants to do philosophy of religion, you would first have to start by proving that a God exists, then prove that the type of God exists is one God, and that it has the characteristics, right, that are ascribed to them in those sacred texts, right, in the Bible, in the Old or the New Testament. Okay, so the difference again is our starting points. We're not presuming that anything is true right off the bat in philosophy of religion. We have to start from scratch and then move towards those arguments for your specific religious tradition. Whereas a theologian will already start by presuming that their scripture and religious texts include the truth, right? And assuming those truths, they will then try to answer those questions. So if you're interested in theology, right, it's important to know that, again, there are different types of theology, some of which are closer to philosophy than others. And so this is the difference between revealed and natural theology. So going back to our earlier discussion of religious experience, revealed theology is the idea that we can answer the questions that theologians are interested in But the knowledge that we are going to get to answer those questions can only come from divine revelation. So this would include a personal religious experience or some sort of testimony from someone else's religious experience, right, as we would get in Scripture. Natural theology, on the other hand, is closer to philosophy of religion because it's going to use the rules of logic. So if you get into philosophy of religion, one of the, probably most prominent philosophers that you'll discover is Thomas Aquinas, and he would be considered a natural theologian, right? Because he does adhere to the tenets of Christianity, but he does philosophy in the sense that he's not just going to be starting off by assuming that all the doctrines in Christianity are true. He's first going to argue that God exists, that it is a single God, and later on that God must have the qualities, right, that are ascribed to. And so he's going to be using, right, the laws of logic and reason to demonstrate that knowledge, right? So natural theology in this case ends up being the closest to philosophy of religion, right? So it's both combining philosophy as well as one's theological commitments. All right, some other terms that are going to be important as we enter into our discussions are different types of beings.